Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into something that affects us all, whether we realize it or not,
Yeah.
the U.S. China trade war.
Right.
Our main source for this is this really interesting article from Investor
What?
called The U.S. China Trade War, a complex rivalry with economic consequences. And it's got some pretty wild information in here. It really makes you think about the world in a whole new light.
It really does. It kind of brings into focus just how interconnected everything is, like from the clothes we wear to the technology we use.
Yeah.
And the choices these two giants make have ripple effects across the globe. It's pretty crazy.
So let's start with China's insane economic rise over the past 40 years. I mean, the article mentions that their growth rate has been 4 times that of the U.S.
Yeah, it's really remarkable when you think about it.
Yeah.
And it's really led to a pretty big power shift. I mean, when you look at like purchasing power parity,
Yeah.
which, this is essentially a measure of what people can buy with their money in their own country.
Right.
China's economy has actually surpassed the U.S.,
Wow.
which is a huge deal.
That's a game changer.
Yeah.
What does that mean for us, though? Like, how does that actually affect our daily lives?
Well, I mean, think about it. China's demand for everything has skyrocketed, right?
Yeah.
From oil to food. And that influences prices worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
Their manufacturing power, obviously, that affects what we buy and how much we pay for it.
Right.
And then their investments in infrastructure and development around the globe are giving them a lot more political and economic clout.
So it's not just numbers on a spreadsheet, it's actually affecting the real world.
Exactly. And that's why understanding this trade war is so important. It's kind of like a symptom of this larger power shift and the tensions it creates.
So let's unpack that a little. The article talks about how former President Trump took this, really aggressive stance toward China, even calling it the greatest theft in the history of the world.
Right.
Was that just campaign rhetoric, or was there something more behind it?
I mean, his accusations definitely resonated with some people, right?
Yeah.
A segment of the American public that felt kind of left behind by globalization.
Mm-hmm.
But it also reflected this genuine concern among some policymakers that China's economic practices were actually harming American businesses and workers.
Right.
So, I mean, they pointed to things like intellectual property theft,
Right.
forced technology transfers,
Yeah.
and just general unfair trade practices.
So Trump decides to hit back with tariffs, right? Starting with aluminum and steel.
Yeah.
I mean,
He imposed tariffs on a lot of Chinese goods,
right.
hoping to kind of pressure them to change their behavior.
And China retaliated, of course.
Right, of course.
They targeted American products like soybeans, and it created this whole tit-for-tat thing. But was it effective?
I mean, that's a good question.
Yeah.
The article mentions that the trade deficit between the U.S. and China actually grew during the trade war.
Right, it did. It reached a record $891 billion in 2022.
Right, so it's kind of crazy.
But, attributing that solely to the tariffs is probably an oversimplification. I mean, global supply chains were being disrupted by the pandemic at the same time, and demand for certain Chinese goods remained strong despite the added cost.
Right, so you can't just say the tariffs failed. There were other things going on.
Right, exactly.
But what about the impact on American businesses and consumers?
Well, U.S. manufacturers, they face increased production costs, obviously, because of the tariffs.
Right.
And, that led to job losses in some sectors.
Yeah.
And ultimately, those tariffs just got passed down to consumers in the form of higher prices,
Right.
which, fueled inflation.
Right.
So while the intention might have been to protect American interests, the reality is it kind of created this mixed bag of consequences.
It sounds like this approach of confrontation was a big departure from how the U.S. dealt with China in the past. Oh, absolutely. I mean, for decades, the dominant strategy was engagement.
Right.
The idea was that economic cooperation would eventually lead to political stability and that China would adopt, more Western-style values. But Trump, along with some of his advisors like General H.R. McMaster and Matthew Pottinger, argued that China's growing power was making it more aggressive.
Okay.
And that engagement had basically failed.
So they felt the U.S. needed to take a tougher stance, even if it meant an economic conflict. Is that where the idea of wolf warrior diplomacy comes in?
That's a good question.
Because I've heard that term thrown around, but I don't really know what it means.
So wolf warrior diplomacy basically refers to a much more assertive and confrontational approach that China has adopted recently.
Okay.
And it's characterized by a willingness to really challenge the U.S.-led global order
Okay.
and to defend China's interests much more forcefully.
Can you give me an example of what that looks like in practice?
Sure. So, like, one example would be China's response to, the international criticism over its handling of the Hong Kong protests
Mm-hmm.
or its treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province.
Right.
Instead of just deflecting or downplaying the criticism,
Right.
which is what they might have done in the past, they've responded with, pretty defiant rhetoric and even sanctions against some foreign officials and entities.
So it's a much more assertive, even aggressive
It's
approach than what we've seen before.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's a reflection of their growing confidence
Okay.
and their belief that they don't really need to play by the rules that are set by the West anymore.
This is all fascinating, but it also feels pretty heavy.
Yeah.
What does this shift in China's diplomacy mean for the average person?
Well, it's a signal that, the world is becoming more multipolar.
Okay.
For decades, the U.S. was the undisputed leader, right?
Right.
Setting the agenda for global affairs.
Yeah.
But now China's challenging that.
So we're going from like one main decision maker to multiple power centers,
Yeah.
each with their own interests and priorities. How does that play out in our daily lives?
Well, think about the technology we use, right?
Yeah.
China's advancements in areas like artificial intelligence and 5G are forcing the U.S. to step up its game.
Right.
This competition, it could actually lead to faster innovation
Okay.
and even lower prices for consumers in the long run.
So that's the upside. What about the potential downsides?
Well, a more multipolar world can also be more unstable and unpredictable.
Right.
If these power centers can't figure out a way to cooperate and manage their differences, we could see increased tensions,
Yeah.
economic instability,
Yeah.
and even conflict.
So it sounds like we're at a crossroads.
Yeah,
And the choices made by the U.S. and China in the coming years will have huge implications.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's a complex and evolving situation.
Right. Right.
So it's crucial that we, as informed citizens, understand the dynamics at play.
This is really starting to connect the dots for me. I'm seeing how these seemingly distant events and decisions have an actual impact on our lives. We've covered a lot of ground, though. What's next?
Well, we've talked about China's rise and the shift in U.S. strategy,
Right.
but we haven't really explored, the potential future scenarios for this relationship.
Right.
Should the U.S. continue down this path of confrontation? Is cooperation even possible at this point?
Yeah.
What would economic decoupling actually look like?
Right.
And what would it mean for us?
Those are some big questions. I guess we have a lot more to unpack.
You do. And it's going to get even more interesting.
Okay, so we've established that the U.S. China relationship is complicated,
Yeah,
to say the least.
for sure.
And there are some big questions about the future.
Absolutely.
Let's dive into those.
Yeah, let's do it.
Shall we? One of the biggest questions is whether the U.S. and China can actually avoid
Right.
falling into a new Cold War.
Yeah.
Some experts think we're already heading in that direction. With economic decoupling, military buildup,
Yeah.
and these ideological clashes becoming the norm,
Right.
a new Cold War, that sounds kind of ominous.
Yeah.
But wasn't the original Cold War
Yeah.
mostly about nuclear threats and proxy wars?
Right.
How would it be different this time around?
Well, that's a great question. So the original Cold War was definitely shaped by, the threat of nuclear annihilation.
Right.
And that cast a long shadow over everything.
Yeah.
But today, technology plays a much bigger role.
Right.
We're seeing competition in like artificial intelligence, 5G, quantum computing,
Right.
biotechnology, all these things.
So instead of a nuclear arms race, it's a tech race.
Exactly.
And the stakes are just as high.
Absolutely.
Whoever controls those technologies will have a huge advantage
Yeah,
in terms of economic power and global influence.
for sure.
So we could see a world divided into two tech spheres, each with their own standards and platforms and alliances. What would that mean for the average person?
It could affect everything
Wow.
from, the smartphones we use to the social media platforms we access.
Yeah.
Imagine like a world where your iPhone doesn't work in China because they've
Yeah.
adopted a different operating system,
Right.
or you can't get on Facebook or Twitter because they're blocked by the government.
That's a pretty stark picture. It makes me wonder if economic decoupling is even inevitable in this new Cold War scenario. We're already seeing some of that, right? With supply chains shifting away from China.
Right.
What would that even look like?
So economic decoupling would basically involve reducing trade and investment ties between the U.S. and China.
Okay.
It would mean, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S.
Right.
or diversifying supply chains so we rely less on China.
But wouldn't that make everything more expensive for everyone?
Yeah.
I mean, China's become the world's factory for a reason.
Yeah, it's true. Decoupling could lead to higher prices in the short term.
Right.
But, people who support it argue that it's necessary to protect our national security and reduce our dependence on, a potential adversary.
So it's like a trade-off. Potentially higher costs in exchange for greater security and independence.
Exactly.
And there's no easy answer.
Right. It's really complicated. It involves economics, politics, even ethical dilemmas.
Speaking of ethical dilemmas, we haven't really talked about the human rights aspect of this whole rivalry.
Yeah.
China's been criticized a lot for its treatment of Uyghur Muslims, its crackdown on dissent in Hong Kong, its lack of political freedoms. How do those issues even factor into this whole thing?
I mean, they're a significant factor.
Yeah.
It's another layer of complexity.
Yeah.
Some people argue that the U.S. has this moral obligation to pressure China to improve its human rights record.
Right.
Even if it means, sacrificing some economic benefits.
But wouldn't that be seen as interfering in China's internal affairs? I mean, they have a very different political system, cultural values than we do in the West.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's definitely a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
Finding the right approach is tough.
Right.
Because it involves navigating cultural differences, respecting national sovereignty.
Yeah.
But also promoting universal human rights.
It sounds like there's no easy solution.
Nope.
Every action has potential consequences.
Pretty much.
Which makes me wonder if cooperation is even possible between two countries with such different values.
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It's definitely challenging.
Yeah.
But I believe there are areas where cooperation is both possible and absolutely essential.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Where do you see potential for common ground?
Well, I mean, climate change is one area where cooperation is vital. Both the U.S. and China are major emitters of greenhouse gases.
Right.
And they need to work together to address this.
Yeah.
I mean, we've actually seen some signs of collaboration on this front.
Okay.
Even amidst the trade war.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, it is.
Are there any other areas where we could see some collaboration?
Global health is another big one.
Yeah.
I mean, the pandemic really highlighted how interconnected we are.
Right.
And that we need international cooperation to combat infectious diseases.
That's true. No one country can solve these problems alone.
Exactly.
It requires collaboration and willingness to find common ground.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we're all part of this global community. And our fates are all intertwined.
This has given me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
It's clear that this U.S.-China relationship is incredibly complex, and there are no easy answers. But one thing is for sure, it's going to shape the 21st century.
Absolutely.
It's something we all need to pay attention to. It's interesting. We've talked about all these complex strategies.
Yeah.
Competition, cooperation, decoupling. But it all comes down to people in the end, right?
It really does. It's easy to get lost in those abstract discussions about power and economics.
Right.
But the choices made by governments and businesses have real-world consequences for people on both sides.
For sure. I'm thinking about, the American farmers who lost their market for soybeans when China put those retaliatory tariffs in place.
Right.
Or the factory workers in China whose jobs might be affected if we see more economic decoupling.
Yeah, absolutely.
These are real people whose livelihoods are being impacted.
Exactly. And it's not just about, jobs and economic security either.
Right.
It's about the cultural exchanges, the personal connections, the shared experiences that, a healthy U.S.-China relationship can bring.
I remember reading about how Chinese students studying in the U.S. felt increasingly unwelcome during the Trump era because of all the tension.
Yeah.
Those personal stories really hit home.
They do. It highlights how important people-to-people diplomacy is.
Yeah.
Even when governments are at odds, fostering understanding and building those bridges between citizens can really help.
So what can the average person do to contribute to a more positive and productive U.S.-China relationship?
That's a great question.
It feels like such a huge issue. It's hard to know where to begin.
Yeah. I think the first step is education.
Okay.
Just taking the time to learn about China, its history, its culture, its people. That's essential for overcoming stereotypes and fostering empathy.
It's so easy to fall into that trap of thinking us versus them.
Exactly.
Especially when you're only getting information from one side.
Right. It's crucial to seek out different perspectives, read things from a variety of sources,
Right.
engage in dialogue with people who have different viewpoints.
What about for those of us who aren't diplomats or policymakers?
Yeah,
Are there practical things we can do, in our daily lives to actually make a difference?
absolutely. One thing you can do is support businesses that engage in ethical and sustainable practices in China,
Okay.
choosing to buy products that are made responsibly
Right.
that can have an impact.
Kind of voting with our wallets.
Exactly.
Which sends a message.
Yep. And then, on a more personal level, simply being open to learning about Chinese culture, trying new foods, watching movies, listening to music.
Right.
Those are all ways to kind of build bridges and break down barriers.
Those are great suggestions.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the humanity of the people on the other side,
Yeah.
seeing them as individuals rather than this big monolithic entity.
Exactly.
It's about fostering connections that can go beyond all the political differences and economic competition.
Right.
This deep dive has really shifted my perspective.
Yeah.
I came in thinking about tariffs and trade deficits.
Right.
And now I'm seeing this whole human dimension to the relationship.
Yeah. That's the power of digging deeper, going beyond just the headlines.
I gotta say, though, it's a little daunting to think about how much responsibility we all have in shaping this whole relationship.
It is a big responsibility, but it's also a huge opportunity.
Right.
The choices we make today are going to have an impact on the future, not just for the U.S. and China, but the whole world.
Well said. This has been a really thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity about the U.S.-China relationship. We encourage you to keep learning and engaging and contributing to a more positive future. Thanks for joining us.